Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir Sultan, and I run the events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Dr. Carol Hay's newest book, Think Like a Feminist, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from its original of 48 bookstores until, after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, authors like Carol Hay and Mona Eltahawy, we wouldn't be here today, and we are so very appreciative of it. So, tonight we are thrilled to have with us Dr. Carol Hay for the launch of her newest book, Think Like a Feminist. Dr. Hay is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Massachusetts Lowell and author of the award-winning Kantianism, Liberalism, and Feminism Resisting Oppression. She's written for the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and Eon magazine. She divides her time between Boston and San Francisco. Joining her in conversation is Mona Eltahawy. Mona is a feminist author, commentator, and disruptor of the patriarchy. Her first book, Headscarves and Hymens: Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution, targeted patriarchy in the Middle East and North Africa. And her second, The Seven Necessary Sins for Women and Girls Took Her Disruption Worldwide. Her commentary has appeared in media around the world, and she makes video essays as Feminist Giant, which is also the name of the newsletter of which she is the founder and editor-in-chief. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Hay and Mona to the stage.
Great. Hello, Carol, and hello, everyone who's watching. My name is Mona Eltahawy. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I begin everything, as always, with my declaration of faith: fuck the patriarchy. Hello, Carol.
Hello, Mona. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Carol Hay. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I could not be more thrilled or more honored to be doing this conversation with you. So.
It is a delight, Carol, because I loved reading your book, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. And so I thought I would start with kind of like a basic question and just ask you, what was the inspiration? Was there a moment where you thought, okay, I need to write this book that brings all these incredible feminist philosophers into play in this really wonderful, accessible way that you use in the book? Or was this something you've been planning for a while? What made you write this book?
I don't think there was like a penny drop moment. And basically, I think, I got tenure. I had a little more flexibility with what I could write professionally. And I do think I was just sort of increasingly pissed off. I was angry at the misconceptions of feminism that I really saw over and over again. I saw it in the classroom. I saw it, on social media. I came across people in bars, and I just got so tired of hearing the same mistakes over and over and over. And they seem sort of like, in many cases, a sort of willful blindness to what feminism was really all about. But in other cases, just sort of like, I think, a more innocent ignorance about what feminism was really up to. And I wanted to do what I could to correct that. And I like writing for big groups of people. I don't just like doing academic writing. I mean, I do that too. But for me, the chance to sort of reach a broader audience is really exciting. And Norton was willing to bite and give me a book contract. And here we are. I think it was, I mean, when I started writing the book, it was in some ways a very different world, right? Like they were saying, oh no, women are going to be trending this election season, because everyone thought that, it was going to be very, very different. I mean, we were going to have a female nominee, these sorts of things, but that didn't happen. But I do think that so many of the lessons of feminism are so timeless. Unfortunately, the world is not changing as fast as I think we feminists would like. And so a lot of this stuff just remains as relevant as ever.
Absolutely. I think, these days, we were talking earlier before we went live about, this particular moment, especially in US history, where, we watched an insurrection last week. We watched second impeachment, Donald Trump was impeached for the second time today. Yes. And one of the things that has always reminded me that feminism is so vital and so relevant is, what Donald Trump represents, what his time in office represents, and the incredible and so alarming number of women, white women voters in the United States who vote for him. So these are always on my mind, whenever something happens. And I think your book is especially relevant now because we can use the lessons of the feminist philosophers that you bring up in the book to address this moment. So let's talk about the US a bit before we dig deeper into your book.
Yeah.
How do you see what happened last week and what is happening now through the lenses of these feminist philosophers that you introduce us to?
Well, I think, as you say, what we understand is that these harms, these injustices, they're not unconnected to other things, right? So I don't think you can really understand what's motivating Trump and his supporters without understanding not just the forces of sexism, but also the forces of racism, capitalism, transphobia, homophobia, fascism in general, right? So all of these different oppressions are interconnected, and that's one of the things that I really, really wanted to emphasize in the book, is that a feminism that only thinks that takes its only job to talk about women is a really kind of blinkered feminism. I think that we have seen that historically in the feminist movement. Feminist theorists really sort of focusing on a specific kind of woman, often a very privileged woman, right? A white woman, a cis woman, a middle class or wealthy woman, a straight woman, and sort of said, this is what it is to be a woman, and these are our problems, and feminism's job is to solve it. And I think one of the things that the movement has taken 2 steps forward and 1 step back with is finally is getting better at realizing that when we say women, we better damn well mean all women. And I think that sort of armed with that that theoretical lens, you can really see a lot of the harms that we've seen in the last week really coming into focus, right? So I think that you can't understand what's motivating those people who are storming the Capitol without really having a hard look at what masculinity is and what form of really kind of toxic masculinity is driving these people, for example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm also thinking of, a movement, like a conspiracy theory group like QAnon,
Yeah.
which is largely driven by white women. And one of the things that I appreciate about your book, and it's largely driven by white suburban women, many of whom are those privileged, cisgender, able-bodied women that you talk about in your book. And I really appreciate that you say again and again, there isn't this singular notion of woman. There isn't this one woman that we can talk about, because I cannot talk in the same breath about the 2 QAnon women elected to the House of Representatives, for example, and then also talk about all the other women who work in the house, whether in the janitorial staff, in the kitchens, in all the other, whose lives are completely different than these very, very privileged women who are espousing fascism. So what do we do to explain to people that you cannot portray womanhood as this singular experience and expect feminism to just come and sprinkle, magic dust?
So, I mean, I think for me, taking a really good hard look at the history of feminism and its history of mistakes, its history of doing just that, right? Of women with the social power to have their voices heard, being the ones steering the feminist ship for generations, really. And I think that we're finally starting to see a shift. But again, this is something that even amongst feminists, this is not something that happens easily or consistently. So what do we do? I think we have to sort of really, and in part, I think this is the value of your work, right? Where you amplify women's voices from around the globe, right? And it's like you spend 5 minutes in your Twitter feed or in, leafing through your books, and you see that like what it is to be a woman is incredibly varied. But there probably are some commonalities, and in some sense, the commonalities are the injustices that we face at the hands of patriarchy. Now, of course, privilege is going to insulate different women from different parts of patriarchy's wrath. But, and again, that's where we have to be really careful to really sort of focus our feminist energies on the women who need the help the most, right? And not privileged women like me, right? Who are white, able-bodied, cisgender, these sorts of things, right? My concerns shouldn't be the primary concerns of the movement. And I think, again, we are seeing that. And this is, again, I think the value of your work, that you're so great at doing that, of amplifying all women's voices.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Something that I truly appreciate about your book is your use of metaphors, when you get into the chapter on oppression, because I think one of the hardest things to explain to people is the concept of patriarchy, is what, oppression. What does it mean? Because, the textbook definition is patriarchy is a system of oppressions that privileges male dominance. And I always find that just goes above people's heads. They just roll their eyes, or they think that patriarchy means men. So like, you just hate all men. And obviously that is not the case. So talk to us about these wonderful metaphors that you bring up in the chapter on oppression.
Yeah, sure. So again, this is my experience is sort of, it's the best way to kind of get the idea of oppression really in your head. I like another metaphor that I like is that of juggling, right? So I like to throw all of these metaphors at you, and you're juggling all of them. And once they're all in there, then you probably have some kind of sense of what this concept actually is, right? And I like to emphasize that the word oppression, like, it's a piece of jargon, right? It's not like just like a really bad harm, right? It actually, when feminist philosophers, political philosophers use the word oppression, they have something very particular in mind, right? And so that's one of the things I try to lay out with these metaphors, right? So I have the metaphor, I think the most powerful metaphor, it comes from the philosopher Marilyn Frye, and that's of a bird cage, right? So she says, you want to understand what oppression is, say that you're looking at a bird, and this is a sickly bird, right? This bird is just failing to thrive, right? And you're looking right up close to the bird, and you can't figure out what the hell is your problem, bird, right? You've got a pile of seed right over there. You're not even bothering to walk over there. Help, you're a bird, you can fly, right? So you're telling this bird, like, come on, bird, just go, like, take care of yourself, right? Pull yourself up by your bird bootstraps and, flourish. And it's just failing to thrive in any real way. And you can't figure out why for the life of you, right? But then you step back just a foot, and you see a wire in between you and the bird. You're like, oh, okay, well, that explains why the bird's not coming this way, because there's a wire in its way. Like, it's not like razor wire or electric wire, but it's wire, right? And that wire by itself explains gives you part of the story about why the bird is staying put, right? But again, then you're thinking, seriously, one wire, bird, you're going to let one wire get in the way of what you need to do to thrive? Like, suck it up, grit, come on. And then you step back a little more, and you see another wire, and it's actually attached to the first wire, right? And then you see another wire and another wire and another wire, and you realize, it's in a bird cage, right? And the bird cage is comprised of wires, each of which by itself isn't really capable of doing anything to a bird, but collectively, because they're interrelated in the right ways, these wires completely constrain what's possible for the bird, right? So this, Frye says, is a really useful metaphor for understanding oppression, right? It's these collective injustices, harms that are all connected up in the right kind of way, right? By themselves, a lot of these things, like, what even just like would be a minor inconvenience, right? But collectively, because they're interrelated with other oppressive harms and injustices, they completely constrain what's possible for a bird, or in the case of sexist oppression, a woman, right? And so these, so the thought is that this explains why feminists often seem to focus on things that people might find sort of trivial. Like, why do feminists keep going on about like mansplaining and like the lack of pants with functional pockets and like catcalling and manspreading and like all of these things, again, like by themselves? I mean, some of them are biggies, like disproportional rates of sexual violence and things like that, right? But a lot of the things that feminists focus on, if you're looking at things microscopically, might seem like not that big a deal, right? And it's only when you really have this big picture, macroscopic view that everything comes into focus, and you really have a sense of what the picture is. So I think this is a really powerful metaphor for understanding the forces of oppression. It explains why it's, when talking about individual harms, you're always in part talking about how those harms or injustices are connected up to other harms or injustices, right? So that's a powerful metaphor I really like. Let's see if I'm not sure if I want to go on through all of them. I can get in sort of like teacher mode, because I think it's also cool too. But another metaphor that I think that is really important, and this actually connects up to some of the stuff we were already talking about, is that of the traffic intersection. Right. So this comes from Kimberly Crenshaw, philosopher of race and a legal philosopher. And so Crenshaw's conception of intersectionality has been taken up in some ways by the larger public. Sometimes people sort of like scowl, they hear intersectionality and they think, oh, that's just some buzzword. But the concept itself is actually really quite simple and very important, right? So the basic thought is, Crenshaw says, imagine that you are standing at a traffic intersection. Right. So if it's like a sleepy four-way stop in the middle of a country, like a quiet country road, and you're standing at a four-way stop, it's going to be pretty easy to reconstruct any kind of traffic accidents that happens in that geographical location, right? It's just, there's just not that many factors going on, right? It's a simple intersection, right? But of course, if you're in Massachusetts, which is where I live now, we have these rotaries that are fucking insane. They are so scared. Like, so traffic's coming in a million different directions, and all the locals have like been driving these roads for years, know exactly where they want to go. And it's like you're taking your life in your hand whenever you drive in one of these fucking rotaries, I swear. So if you're trying to reconstruct a traffic accident that this happened in one of these Massachusetts rotaries, it's going to be a lot more complex. There are just a lot more factors going in, and sort of and the interplay between these factors is going to be complicated, and maybe not even necessarily something that you can predict beforehand. Right? So that's really the basic lesson of intersectionality. The thought is that if you can think of the harms that a woman experiences as a woman, right, sexist harms, that might be sort of one part of the rotary, right? But then you have to ask, okay, well, are there any other axes of oppression that this individual faces, right? Is she subject to racism? Is she subject to classism? Is she subject to some kind of oppression on the basis of her religion or ableism, and on and on and on, right? So the thought is that the more of these axes of oppression that we combine, it's not a matter of layering on, because they sort of intermingle, right? You get these beautiful metaphor from Maria Lugones, who's a Latinx or Latina philosopher, who says like the image is almost one of curdling, right? Like it all just messes up, and you can't necessarily disentangle all the threads, but you know that the result is an individual who has faced serious injustice. But so we have to really sort of remember that the more oppressed you are, the more complex your oppression is going to be. And then the role of feminists and anti-racists and others is to really actually talk to people who have those experiences, because they're going to be the ones who are the experts in figuring out what went wrong and how we get out of this mess, right? So this is really what so it's a theoretical justification for amplifying the voice of marginalized women, women of color, queer women, exactly the women that you focus on in your work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so again, like I said, I love the metaphors, and I'm glad that you gave us, two so beautifully now. And then everyone go read Carol's book, because you have to read about the other two metaphors, which are also excellent. So one of the things that I also especially enjoyed about your book is that you have sex and gender, and you talk about the social construction of both, because usually we talk about gender as a social construct, and that's where the sentence begins and ends, and you say yes, and here is why, and you have a whole chapter about that. But then you continue the conversation, and you insist that we all pay more attention to how sex is a social construct. Talk to me about that and why that was important.
Yeah. So, and again, this theoretical movement or development actually is a historical development in feminist theorizing. It's like there really was a very long time in feminist theory where the thought was sex was just biology, right? That's just your parts, right? And that's just natural, right? That's you're born with that. And gender is this social construct. So people would you get these phrases like sex is the social or rather gender is the social interpretation of sex and things like that. So sex or gender is how we identify, how others identify us in virtue of what is presumed to be in our pants. Right. And that really was kind of like the feminist view for a solid like 20, 30 years. Right. So the term for this, some feminists call this now, they call it the coat rack view of sex and gender. Right. Because the thought is that the body is this sort of given, it's this pre-theoretical given, which is there. And different cultures layer gendered garments, both like literally, right, but also figuratively. Right. So gender is this thing that's layered onto the natural body. That's the coat rack view of feminism. And that view of feminism is really kind of a historical relic at this point, for the most part. Like most feminists have really kind of moved on, and they understand, as you were saying, not just gender to be a social construct, but also sex. And again, that is a little bit more unintuitive, right? It's like you get a lot more eyebrows starting to raise. Like, what do you mean? Sex is a social construct? Like you either have a penis in your pants or you don't, right? And so understanding that, it takes a little bit more feminist theory, but again, it's not that complex. And basically the thought is that you take a strategy that we get from Judith Butler, who is a very, very famous and well-respected feminist theorist. And Butler points out that the way we categorize the world is always a decision that's motivated by power, right? So we have to ask whose interests are served by carving up the world in this way. And then once we start doing that, we start to realize maybe if the world could be carved up differently. And again, we look historically, globally, has every culture that's ever existed carved things up so that there were only two sexes? No, of course not, right? There's actually a lot more variety than you would think, right? We say things like colonialism imposing sort of narrow gender binaries onto countries that, or rather not countries, but civilizations that didn't actually have that category before it was introduced to them by the West, for example. Right. So So once you start to sort of understand that the history of how of this idea that there are only biological males and biological females, you understand that hasn't been a sort of cross-cultural constant historically, and then you can actually turn to the biologists. Right. And the biologists themselves are saying, no, like it's not as simple as just 2 X chromosomes and 2 Y chromosomes or whatever it is, right? Any kind of like biological basis you might have for thinking there are only 2 sexes, male and female, it's oversimplification of a biological reality that's just vastly more complex, right? So Anne Foster Sterling is a really good feminist biologist to read on this, but there are others as well, right? And so then once you really start paying attention to the ways that sex is also a social construct in some ways, then you can start to ask, okay, so what's going on when we deny this, when we insist that sex is a biological reality and there are only males and there are only females? And of course, we know what happens is that the experiences of a hell of a lot of people get left out. Or people get shoehorned into these boxes that don't actually fit for them, right? So we see intersex people, we see trans people, right? We see people whose human experiences are just as fundamental as anyone else's, but they're literally told they don't even exist, right? So one figure that always kind of makes my eyes roll back in my head or something is that apparently, by most estimates, the number of people who are intersex in some way is roughly 3% of the population. Which is roughly on par with the percentage of the population that uses a wheelchair to get around. Right. And so now if you think of all of the changes in our modifications, accommodations in our social world that we make for people who use wheelchairs, I mean, we should be making way more, don't get me wrong, right? But when you think about the ones that we already do make, right? We make curb cuts, we have elevators, we have ramps to get into public buildings, these sorts of things, right? Intersex people just want to be recognized, like they just want their existence to be recognized. Like that's free. That doesn't even take tax dollars, right? And yet so many people are loath to even do that, to even just admit that the human experience does not fit into these really overly narrow categories of only male, only female, right? And this, I think, is where the queer community has represents a huge step forward, right, in understanding what it is to be human. I think just like queer ways of being, queer ways of understanding like who you are, like what your identity is, they're just so much more evolved, I think, than in this sort of mainstream culture. And that's why it's so encouraging to me to see a lot of these experiences starting to filter into the mainstream, right? We're seeing trans actors, we're seeing RuPaul's Drag Race, or Queer Eye, or these sorts of things. And I think it's, to me, it's all to the good that we're seeing a kind of like queering of mainstream culture in a lot of circles. And I know that this is actually something you talk about in your book, in the 7 Sins, right? Of the sin of lust, right? And I think that understanding lust in a queer way, as you do, and as you explain in that chapter, is like it's one of those moments when you're reading a book and you start vibrating because you're so excited that someone's just saying that something's so right. So I wanted to highlight that in your book as well.
Thank you. And it's the queering of feminism is especially important these days, I find, because one of the worst fault lines that exists, and sadly so much of it exists in England, are TERFs, the trans exclusionary radical feminists, and the hateful bigotry that so many of them, from really powerful perches, like from academia, from media, I mean, the amount of transphobia that is platformed in UK media is just horrific and so ugly. And so I really appreciate your laying down of, not just Judith Butler, but other feminist theorists and other thinkers who are challenging the way that we think of feminism, in this necessarily queer way. And it's especially important in England because just a couple of weeks ago, a well-known academic was honored by the Queen. Now, not that I give a flying fuck about the royal family, because, fuck the monarchy and fuck their colonial history. So, I don't even recognize the awards that they give. But, in the UK, it's important to be on the Queen's honor list,
Yeah.
So talk to us a bit about this academic and just what an awful moment it was to see that.
It's so frustrating, I have to say. I mean, I have this frustration. I feel like the left is really good at cannibalizing itself, right? Like I think that the right is much better at sort of like sticking together across difference and getting shit done, right? Whereas I think the left, like too often there's a kind of purity politics, and we're not like, oh, you're not good enough on this issue, therefore we can't be allies, and that frustrates the hell out of me, right? I really am more a coalition builder by nature, and so I sometimes worry that, because I really have decided I am taking on the TERFs. I don't care. And so I sometimes worry that I'm playing into this tendency that we on the left have to sort of fight amongst ourselves as opposed to focusing on the real enemy. But when someone like Kathleen Stock does what she does, it's impossible for me not to say something. And it's I have to say that I'm sure this is nothing in comparison to what you get on a daily basis, given your social media platform and things like that. But like once I started doing public philosophy, once I went out as a feminist philosopher, started writing op-eds and things like that, I got used to the hate mail and the occasional death threat or threatening email, and like that's the price of doing business, right? And you sort of tell yourself like, if I'm not pissing these people off, I'm not doing my job. So I got used to that when I started writing about feminism in the public sphere. I was not prepared for what was going to happen when I started writing about trans issues. The vitriol, the threats that I've gotten from TERFs are exponentially more than I've ever gotten from any kind of conservative fascist person. And again, it's heartbreaking, right? Because we're supposed to be, we all consider ourselves feminists, and yet the TERFs are the ones that I don't know. I am now of the position that sometimes people say that TERF is a slur, right? TERF is an acronym. It stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. And TERFs really don't want to be called TERF. They want you to call them gender critical feminists. And I'm of the mind that, okay, so it's a literal description of what you are. You're a radical feminist who excludes trans people. Therefore, you're a TERF. Except I've been lately thinking that actually maybe that's not right, because I don't think that anyone who discriminates against trans women the way TERFs do should get to call themselves a feminist at all. Like, no, actually, I'm going to take that one back. You just don't get to call yourself a feminist anymore, because you are actively harming women, right? And so this is what Stock does, and it's really, really disappointing to see. And I don't know. There's a moment within philosophy itself, but within the discipline of philosophy itself, which is weird, right? Because for the longest time, if you were a feminist philosopher, mainstream philosophers didn't give a shit about you. They would say, like, I don't understand what feminist philosophy is. That's not a thing. Like, so it didn't like when I started doing feminist philosophy, like back in grad school, most mainstream philosophers didn't recognize what I was doing as philosophy. And that's shifted in really, really exciting ways. So now feminist philosophy is much more closer to the mainstream. It's much more taken seriously by mainstream philosophers, which is exciting for me, right? But at the same time, now suddenly all of these people with no training whatsoever in feminist philosophy, people like Kathleen Stock, are coming in and saying, "Oh, I'm going to do feminist philosophy now, and I'm going to claim to have opinions about about shit that feminists have been talking about for 50 years, and just invent some position and not engage with the literature at all." And then when feminist philosophers point out that, okay, so you're saying stuff that has been debunked, or you're giving us arguments that that have been shown to be shitty arguments, and we've known this for like 20 years. When you point these out to these TERFs, they say that you're silencing them, right? They pull the censorship card, and like anything should be should be the sort of thing that philosophers can talk about. And I mean, I do think that many trans activists want to insist, no, like, my humanity isn't something that is up for philosophical discussion. Fuck you, right? And I totally respect that, right? But my partner is trans, so I have a dog in this fight. But he and I were just talking about this today, and he was saying, no, I think that, like, yeah, I mean, you want to have a philosophical discussion about this, sure, but like, don't pretend that you can just make this shit up without actually engaging with 50 years of literature, which is what unfortunately TERFs don't do. So yeah, it's one of these sort of turf wars in philosophy itself, but it would be nice if that was all the problem was. But really, what the problem is that these things spill out into the world at large, right? And this is not just a theoretical discussion about the nature of womanhood, right? This is a political battle over whether or not trans women are going to get basic access to healthcare, to gender affirming healthcare, or to be able to use the restroom that they want without fear of violence, or all sorts of gender-based violence that trans and non-conforming people, gender non-conforming people face. And so these things have real-world consequences, right? So I think TERFs want to just insist, oh, no, we're just having a philosophical discussion, but then the political damage they do actually affects real people. So yeah, it's frustrating.
Yeah, and it's incredibly dangerous, as you're saying, because the number, especially of Black trans women and trans people of color that are killed every year in the US, globally, but the US numbers are sometimes a bit more accessible. This definitely, this kind of hate, this kind of bigotry absolutely has echoes in the real world. And this is one of the reasons I say fuck a lot, and I'm not a fan of civility or politeness or respectability, because I always say, if you don't recognize my humanity, if you don't acknowledge the humanity of someone, the full humanity of someone, you don't deserve politeness or respectability at all. Yeah. So I'm really glad that, that you lay that out in your book. And this is an argument, a different kind of argument, but, feminists have also argued over things like pornography and rape and sexual violence and what to do with all of the above, some of the above. And it's been a difficult fight because, whether second wave feminism, sex positive feminism, there's a lot. And, feminist theorist Andrea Dworkin is back. I know a lot of people, especially in the Me Too, since the current iteration of Me Too. So 2006, Tarana Burke was saying Me Too, but in 2017, when white actresses came out against Harvey Weinstein, yeah, I saw a lot of younger feminists, referring to Andrea Dworkin's work. So what did she contribute to the discussion, and what is misunderstood about her? Because there is a lot that is misunderstood about her.
Yeah, absolutely. So Andrea Dworkin teamed up and did a lot of writing with another philosopher, Catherine McKinnon. And their work focused in some ways primarily on pornography. And that work, I think, has been really, really misunderstood, right? There really was a war amongst feminists between the sex positive feminists, or the self-styled sex positive feminists on one hand, and then the radical feminists like Dworkin and McKinnon, who wanted us to take a really, really hard look at our culture's understanding of sexuality and the role that porn played in it. And now, unfortunately, McKinnon and Dworkin, I think they made some theoretical missteps. I think that they took some sort of some questionable psychology and made some pretty brute empirical claims, right? So they claimed that watching pornography is directly responsible for sexual violence against women. So the thought is a guy watches porn and he goes and rapes a woman, and that is just far too brute. You can't obviously those empirical claims are false, right? They've not stood the test of time. But they use those empirical claims to actually pass legislation in some places in the U.S. And actually, a version of their argument was actually enshrined into the Canadian code as well, and. So they were actually trying to ban pornography, which kind of seems quaint now, right, with the internet, because this is all before the internet, right? So yeah, but they're talking about, blue movie theaters and VCR tapes and things like that, right? Mm-hmm. But they wanted to ban pornography because they thought that it was directly responsible for rape, for sexual violence against women. And so I think that for a long time they really sort of fell out of vogue because it's obviously the empirical claims are false. The legal claims didn't work, right? All of the censorship bans were knocked down. They unfortunately were willing to sort of make political hay with some pretty awful regressive conservatives in that period as well. So I think they probably rightly faced some backlash from that. But I think you're right that now we're sort of having moved through it, and obviously, the pro-sex feminists have won, thank God, right? And sex is everywhere, and we couldn't ban porn if we wanted to now that there's the internet. But we still have the questions, I think, that Dworkin and McKinnon had us asking in the first place. And in some ways, I don't think we've made a lot of progress on those questions. And the basic question is, what the fuck is wrong with us? Collectively, right? When you look at heterosexual erotic norms, right? What the thought is when you look at how men and women are trained to think of themselves erotically and to think of each other erotically, it is deeply, deeply fucked up. It's deeply misogynist, right? And it's horrifying, right? Because sex sells, but sex is just so deeply tied to who we are, right? To our identity, our sense of self. And it's horrifying to think that something that's as deeply ingrained a part of you as your sexuality has been fucked up by patriarchy. But it has. Right, and it would be shocking if it hadn't, right? Because you didn't spring into existence yesterday like a mushroom growing up out of the ground, as Hobbes would say, right? By the time you become a fully grown sexual adult, you've drunk a lot of Kool-Aid, and that Kool-Aid is sexist. It's misogynist through and through, right? So I think those are the questions that feminists like McKinnon and Dworkin are really, really good at getting us to pay attention to. Again, I think that. there's a lot of room for hope. There's no feminist porn, so people making explicit porn that's explicitly intended to be feminist, which is the thought is, so it's not derogatory towards women, it's not demeaning towards women. It doesn't celebrate or condone violence against women, which a lot of really mainstream pornography does, right? So I think that we see feminist porn now. We see again a lot of sort of ways out, a lot of imaginative possibilities that we see coming from queer people, right? So I think again that like we're making progress as a society, but we're definitely still pretty messed up.
Absolutely, and I'm especially concerned with the alliances that continue to be made between some so-called feminists and Christian conservatives and groups, that look on sex through this strictly moral lens or puritanical lens, because I see it happening in the US and I see it happening in the UK. So we have the swerfs and the turfs, so that the sex worker exclusionary radical feminists, again, you refuse to call them feminists because we should, because they are willing to make all these really dangerous alliances with, QAnon, for example, this conspiracy group that is in the news more and more now because of the insurrection last week, because they were such a presence in the US Capitol last week, because they largely drove what was happening. This is a group that is largely driven by white women now, largely suburban white women who use this concern, this conspiracy theory about children and child trafficking as this kind of like face for the most horrendous kind of white supremacy. It gives their white supremacy kind of like permission to flourish in the way that in the UK, all these, the mums blogs, right? Mumsnet and all these other things give them this kind of like polite white face to be transphobic. And, that for me is like, regardless of where in the world you live, whether I'm talking about my country of birth, Egypt, or my country of naturalization, the US, we must resist allying ourselves with any kind of conservative right-wing reactionaries, because even if that makes our work shorter or easier, it ends up hurting us the most. Yeah. How do we convince feminists this is a losing battle? Come on, we should know what the fuck.
No, I know, yeah, but it really is. It's a matter of making a deal with the devil, right? And again, McKenna and Dworkin did it back in the 70s and 80s, and I think you're right that we see the tendency even now, right? There was a piece in the New York Times just I think today or yesterday, sort of tutting about all of these, it was a sort of gender lens about like looking at the ways women are trying to make it through the pandemic economically, right? Because they've lost their jobs. Because again, we know that most of the people who have lost their jobs through the pandemic are primarily women, right? So there was this piece sort of like purporting to be concerned about women's economic prospects and how you raise a family, these sorts of things. And they were, it was just straight up tutting about these women who've opened, I forget the name of the platform now, but it's a platform that like OnlyFans, that's right. Yeah, that's right. So they could, like make some money either on the side or maybe even like enough to replace the salary of, of just selling pornographic shots of themselves. And it was just this concern about, oh, these poor women, they have no choice. And like, what are their future employment prospects going to be? And it's like, well, you know what? Their future employment prospects would be a fuck of a lot better if you, the New York Times, wasn't so busy shaming them when you pretend to care about them.
Yeah, absolutely. The slut shaming is especially, and my favorite part of any book on feminism has to be about sex and queerness. So the slut shaming around any aspect of sexuality is, the New York Times in that article just basically took something that was in the New York Post, which is this shitty tabloid in New York City, that slut shamed an EMT worker, a Latinx woman, slut shamed her, revealed her name without her permission because she spoke to them, as long as they didn't reveal her identity, and slut shamed her because she wasn't making enough to support her family. And this pandemic, as you're saying, is a fucking disaster for women. So instead of focusing on just how horrendous and misogynist capitalist patriarchy is and what a fucking disaster the pandemic is to women, what do? Yep. They slut shame women. And that's, a reminder again of why we need feminism. This pandemic is a fucking disaster. Yep. And we just have to just break it all down and burn it all down and say, enough of this. The shaming should be going to capitalism. The shaming should go to the wealthiest country in the world that allows this to happen. This is
no, I know.
No.
Yes, Vera.
It's especially important to bring up issues about pornography and sex work, but also important. And I love that you mention your daughter often in the book, because it's important what we teach children. Now, I'm child-free by choice, but I have nephews and nieces, and I love to have conversations with younger people. It's important now during this pandemic to take this as an opportunity to tell people this is not the way the world should be. So tell us a bit about how you shake the birdcage, when it comes to your daughter. What do we do so we can avoid the pitfalls of the New York Times and the New York Post?
Sure. So I would have to say that so my daughter's now 8.5, and she's now old enough to really start to wrap her head around politics. And I think just the nascent sense of justice that kids have is so well honed that I think that what you like so much socialization is just beating it out of them, beating their inherent sense of right out of them. And so it's just so wonderful to see her time and time again as I filter more and more news toward her, how she has this very clear sense of this is obviously wrong. This is how do we go about fixing things? For the longest time, she's like, well, no, but Mama, where did sexism come from? I'm like, well, I don't really know. She's like, no, but at some point, some man had to decide that he was better than women and he's wrong, but who was that man? I'm like, well, we really don't know. She's like, no, Google it. We can find it out. And I'm like, baby, Mama's an expert on this stuff. We don't know. She's like, Google it. So I will say that, that it is a privilege and an honor to be able to have a child and to politicize her, right? Not in the sense of you must believe what I believe, right? But to just sort of present the facts to her and to see that she really does have the ability to understand the world in these ways, and her sense of justice is so acute, right? So again, what's heartbreaking is that at some point you have to sort of tell her, okay, we can write this. She's currently working on a list. She wants everyone to a petition. That's the word. She's written up a petition because she's discovered that the power lines in the U.S. are very inefficient. And she's like, well, what the fuck? We should change this, right? So she's written up a petition that she's going to send to Joe Biden, dear President Biden, the power lines are inefficient. Can we do something about this? And she's having everyone sign it, right? And so it's I think the sad part is at some point she's going to find out that things are a little more complex than petitions sometimes. But pointing out what's wrong, I think, is easy, and it's and I think it's a privilege, but I also think it's really important. I think too many white people, too many upper class people, too many cis people or straight seeming people think that you're supposed to shelter kids from this, right? You have to sort of protect their innocence. And again, time and time again, I just want to point out what a fucking privilege that is, right? This is not a privilege that mothers of color get to shield their sons from the realities of racism. No, they're teaching them early, you fucking behave in public because the cops are gonna shoot you at 14 if you have a BB gun, right? So the idea that children should be apolitical or that they should be sort of protected from politics, I think, is just straight up a belief born in privilege, and it's one that I think that anyone with any sense of justice needs to just get out of their head as quickly as possible, and that's certainly raise her. She's support.
I'm glad to hear, because it's so necessary. I remember. And after this, I'm going to take the questions because I'm seeing the questions coming through and I'm excited to hear what people have to say. When I was about 7 years old, my family moved from Cairo in Egypt to London in England. And when I first went downstairs to play with the kids, I didn't speak a lot of English. And I had, at the time, very short hair, much like I do now. And I just shaved my head during the pandemic, and I went downstairs to play with the kids. And, this is a reminder of how it's in the air. It's not even something that you need to sit the kids down and say, so this is how it works. And the first thing they asked me was, what's your name? And the second thing they asked me was, are you a boy or a girl? And it was, now I love that I confused them, but it was really, as I continue to confuse people now, because when, the few times I go out to the grocery store with a mask on and nothing visible that you see now, I get looks. People are trying to figure out, where do we put her, or where do we put them, this thing. So the fact that, kids were between the age of 7 to 10 already knew what to expect from a girl or a boy, and I was not presenting that, is a reminder that they imbibe it. You don't even need to sit down and brainwash them into, this is what a girl does, this is what a boy does, because by the age of 7, they've picked it up from school, TV, from family, yes, often. And it's frightening how quickly it takes root, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, I do have to say, so my daughter, she met my trans partner when, I guess about 2 years ago, a little bit less than 2 years ago. And like I regularly see people misgender him, and so I think like as an adult I see the shit that he has to deal with. But like as a kid, she's like, oh, okay, well, you explain this is what the trans experience is. This is a trans person. She's like, cool, right? And like done. Like okay, next, right?
Yeah.
It's just it's simple, right? So like there is an innocence there and an openness. Because they haven't yet had, I think, drunk enough Kool-Aid that they're so completely fucked up, right? But I think you're right that they've definitely had a lot, even by 7 or 8, right? And so I think our job as parents is to sort of, you know, make sure they're getting the right information, and then once they have it, they know it, you know. Yeah.
Run interference between them and patriarchy. Okay, I'm going to click onto the question section now and pick up some questions for you. So here we go, in order of appearance. All right, so here's one question. I've noticed that when I try to talk about the need for change on women's issues, I'm reminded to talk about other groups. What do we do about whataboutery effectively?
Mm-hmm.
I've worked as a rape and domestic violence counselor and have seen the incredible amount of violence against women predominantly and want to advocate change. So what do we do about whataboutery, Carol?
I think the first step is to just do a quick check to make sure that the whataboutery isn't actually catching something, because we all have blind spots, right? We all have, it would be impossible for us to not have blind spots. We live in a racist, sexist, capitalist, homophobic culture, right? So those things, those things are going to be lurking in you somewhere. It'd be impossible for them not to be, right? So do a quick check, right? Is the whataboutery like actually calling me on racism that I wasn't aware of, right? So like do a quick privilege check, right? And then after that, I think like then you have enough to, if it's sincere, right? If the privilege check is sincere, then I think that then you can go back and you can say, well, what I'm talking about is domestic violence in this case, and you're armed with the stats about, you know, how this is specifically a problem that does affect women, and so you can you can insist on the importance of prioritizing issues that affect women primarily, right? Because again, historically, right, we've seen this in a lot of liberation groups, right? That like racism, like, oh, we'll deal with the problems that women of color face later, right? The problem is racism, but really what that means is like how racism affects men, right? We said Elaine Brown, actually, so you and I actually quote the same same passage from Elaine Brown's book in both of our books. So Elaine Brown was the female leader of the Black Panthers for a period of time, right? And she points out how that, you know, pointing like to be a feminist in the Black Power movement was to be anathema, right? Because you were seen as like undercutting your brothers, right? So there is this historical problem of people telling women that their problems can wait, right? That the real problem is classism. The real problem is racism. The real problem is whatever it is the men decide that they care about, right? And women are supposed to just serve the coffee, go along, and our problems will be dealt with eventually. To which I think both you and I say, fuck that, right? So if the whataboutery is an instance of that, well then Mona has your answer, fuck off, right? Right. But if the whataboutery is a request to check your privilege, then do it. I mean, I think we should all just check your privilege 800 times a day, right? Because chances are like we're fucking it up, because it would be weird if we weren't.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so here's the next question. Can you speak to us a little bit more about how we, women not from the US, but who live here, unconsciously amplify the struggle of women in the US as almost a standard experience of struggle that also represents us, but because we physically exist here, but it actually doesn't represent us at all?
That's hard. I mean, I'm guilty of that as well. I'm a Canadian, right? But I live here. And I think, that there is this sort of like, there's this tendency in the history of feminism to sort of present women as this monolithic group, and the interests, and that the women who have the bullhorn are going to be the one who push their interests. And nowadays that's US feminists, right? That's because the US still has, I mean, I guess for a few more years until the fascists sink the country entirely, the US does have a lot of political capital throughout the world. And so I think as US feminists, or as feminists living in the US, I think you're right that we do need to be careful to amplify the voices of women outside of the US, and to not assume that that the problems affecting us are the most pressing or the most important. So yes, just sort of take that lesson from third wave feminism of really prioritizing the interests of marginalized women, not adding them in for some kind of spice. No, like as a feminist, your priority should be women who are the most oppressed. And that is by definition, not women in the US.
Mm-hmm. Great. So this one is from Liz on Facebook. A lot of TERFs make the argument that one of the defining qualities of womanhood is the lived experience of growing up a girl within the patriarchy. Since trans women do not generally have the lived experience of presenting as girls growing up, they do not share a fundamental experience of womanhood. How do I argue against this?
Great question. Very simply, you say, well, what the fuck kind of experience do you think trans women had growing up? Do you think that they had a rosy time growing up trans? Do you think that the world was great for them? Of course not, right? And then you say, okay, I'm sorry. Now, what is the lived experience of growing up a girl? What is that one lived experience? Because that's the move that feminists aren't supposed to make anymore. We're not supposed to say there is a female experience, because when we do, time and time again, what that experience is the experience of privileged women, right? So this is, I think, what TERFs are doing, right? They're making the same mistake that Betty Friedan was making, right? When she said that, that when she was trying to keep lesbians out of the feminist movement, calling them a lavender menace, right? Because they didn't represent the interests of women, meaning women like her, right? Or when she said that there was a problem that has no name, right? Which is the boredom that disaffected housewives had, right? But Friedan said, this is the most pressing problem for women, right? The problem has no name. And you want to say, no, Betty, the biggest problem is probably experienced by, the women of color that you're underpaying for your domestic help, all of you bored housewives in the suburbs, right? So again, time and time again, we have to check this feminist tendency to present the experiences of privileged women as the fundamental female experience. And once you realize that this tendency that we have, once you check for that, you realize the claim, oh, but trans women haven't had the experience of growing up as a woman. All you have to say is, I'm sorry, which one singular experience was that? Because they had an experience, and chances are very good it was pretty awful, probably a hell of a lot worse than you, Karen, right? Yeah, that's the strategy in a nutshell.
Great. Okay, next one. Who gets to decide and label others as TERFs? For instance, Arlene Steen. Is it Steen or Stein?
I'm not familiar.
I think you mentioned her in your book, who wrote Unbound, Transgender Men and the Remaking of Identity. Oh, no, you didn't write about it.
No, I didn't. No, I haven't. Yeah.
Okay. So Arlene Steen, I'm gonna say Steen, maybe Stein, who wrote Unbound, Transgender Men and the Remaking of Identity, has been called a TERF, which doesn't seem to fit in any way from my reading of her book. So who gets to, I haven't read this book, but I've read a lot of critiques of the book.
Okay.
But I think the question applies anyway. So who gets to use this term?
Well, I guess it's always up to someone to respond to the label, right? So if someone says, listen, I think you're being TERFy, then it's up to someone to reply and say, no, I'm not, and here's why, right? But if what someone is doing is attempting to exclude or decenter the experiences of trans women, then if the shoe fits, right? If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck. But I do actually have to say that I'm not familiar with this book or even the criticism of it. Someone, maybe you could speak to that.
Well, I want to get to the questions because we're going to be running out of time. But I know it's a book that has been very controversial very quickly, and a lot of people who so trans activists are not very happy with the book, and so I'm not surprised that the author is being called a TERF. But I want to get to the other questions, and if we have time, we'll come back to it later.
That sounds good.
Next question: how would you change slut shaming?
By owning it, right? And I think this is what we see happen, right? Like you own the term, right? You reappropriate it, right? Queers have done it with the word queer. Women, we can do it with the term slut, right? So we see this, right? For example, with the slut walks and things like that. I mean, I think it's problematic, right? Because I think that the mainstream culture is not set up to want us or allow us to reclaim things like slut, and so too often I think that, and this is actually even something I talk about in the book briefly, that too often when people try to reappropriate the word slut or try to sort of defend the work of sex workers, that gets taken up by the mainstream media, who isn't actually interested in really understanding the feminist point. It gets taken up as a sort of anti-feminist, conservative or regressive way to keep women in an overly sexualized box where their sexuality is not actually for them or by them, but exists for men and for the interests of men. All right. And so I do think that anytime we try to reappropriate a bit of language or an idea or a concept, right, we have to be aware that the mainstream is not going to be happy with us doing it and is going to be looking for ways to misinterpret what we're doing. But that's all there is to do, is to just sort of unabashedly own our sexuality, right? Mona, you speak about the sin of lust so beautifully in your book, right? I think that's what we have to do, is just to stop being ashamed of being sexual beings, to own it, right? And yeah.
I wholeheartedly agree. From Lara on Facebook, were there any topics or philosophers you had to cut from the book that you regret?
Oh, a million. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's yeah, I didn't really talk much about abortion rights, for example, and in part just that there just wasn't time. And so I didn't talk a lot about reproductive rights, reproductive freedoms. Yeah, no, I have 8 more of these in me if I can ever force myself to sit down and write them, because I think that, again, like, the history of the feminist movement is just so rich. That I think that there's just a ton there. I'm seeing over in the chat on the side that I have to say this, my sister is giving me hell for Karen bashing. My sister's name is actually Karen. Hi, Fia, I love you. My Karen is not a Karen, okay? Just so that let the record show, okay?
We know who we're talking about when we talk about Karen.
Yeah,
don't worry.
Yeah, not you. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, next question. Different cultures and societies in their own way develop their own version of misogyny and sexism based on the patterns of patriarchy that are dominant. Do you think at this point in history, we can isolate some specific patterns of misogyny that come almost entirely with the economic hegemony of the West?
Yeah, a bunch of them. I mean, I guess I don't want to paint with 2 broad brushstrokes here, but yeah, I do think that there are major strands of sort of a Western, often Christian or Judeo-Christian form of misogyny that has a particular worldview and understands the relationship between the sexes in a particularly regressive way. I mean, we're all familiar with it, and I do think that one of the horrific offshoots of imperialism was exporting this conception of human beings and the ways that human beings are supposed to relate to each other around the world. So I think, like, you might think that McDonald's is bad, but the heteropatriarchy is worse.
One of the things, if I can jump in and say very quickly, because we've got one more question to go, that kind of very Christian heteropatriarchy imposed itself during colonialism was not only in imposing, like, gender binaries, also in criminalizing sex outside of very heterosexual, cisgendered kind of sex, but also in, like, hypocrisy. So in Egypt, when Egypt was under occupation, was under British occupation, for example, the High Commissioner of the UK, Britain's High Commissioner in Egypt, who was basically kind of like running the show in Egypt, was promoting feminism as a way of saving brown women from brown men. And the same man, Lord Cromer, back in the UK, was against suffrage, for women's suffrage. So for white women, no vote. But because, he's in a country that is not white, and they were trying to make themselves, the kind of like a civilized face of colonization. He's like, yes, women's rights, but only here in Egypt, because we need to save the brown women, which is so often the case when it comes to white heteropatriarchy, isn't it?
Yeah. That's absolutely right. And again, the idea that brown women exist as this class of victims with no voice, no agency, no autonomy, just exist to be saved. That serves a very particular purpose. I mean, it's why we went to a war in Afghanistan, right? We have to save the women from the Taliban. Like, bullshit. You don't care about those women, right? But it's a very convenient excuse, and it has been for many hundreds of years.
Absolutely. Okay, and final question here. 1 in 5 women self-report complete or attempted rape in the US, 25 million women, and only 75% report to the police. What can we do as feminists?
What can we do as feminists? Well, we can fight. We can be open about it. I think this is, to my mind, one of the real benefits of the Me Too movement is that anything that we can do collectively to normalize the discussion of this stuff, right? To send the message to each and every single woman and every girl that this is not you, this is the world, and that you are not alone, and that there's a very good chance that others are in your shoes. I think that that's something as feminists we're bound to do, right? We have to reach out to women to make sure that they know. And honestly, I think the older I get, the more I'm coming around to your strategy, Mona, was just to fight like hell. And like you meet violence with violence. I think that self-defense training isn't enough. I think that we should be training women to beat their assaulters, as you say. And I think that the idea that women aren't going to fight back, that women aren't going to defend themselves, I think that's an idea that has had its time, and I think the world is ready for a little more.
I think also, in addition to what I say about violence, because I also recognize that not all women can fight at all times. And my primary concern is that women survive, but violence should be our right as, a form of self-defense, and sometimes more than that. I'm especially intrigued these days as well by Black feminist theorists who for a long time have been writing about abolition and of the need to move rape and sexual violence away from the criminal justice system, which is so obviously unjust, when it comes, and that's what speaks to the figures, that the person who asked the question, that's what it's all about, that the legal system doesn't take us seriously. The feminist psychiatrist Judith Herman, in her book on, it was called Trauma and Recovery, she says something that I always quote to people when we speak about sexual violence, and it's the legal system was designed to protect men from the superior power of the state, but not to protect women and children from the superior power of men. Yeah. And when you think about the legal system, when you think about the criminal justice system like that, it does not have our interests at heart. And obviously, the more you come from a marginalized group, the less that is the case, So what do we do about rape in this unjust system? We have to dismantle patriarchy, obviously.
It's an easy one, right? Yeah. No.
Of course.
Yeah. I see in the chat someone say, why not tell men to stop? Yeah, absolutely, right? Start with your sons, right? Stop making those jokes about like fathers with shotguns and protecting, like characterizing women's sexuality, girls' sexuality as being this thing that needs to be protected by men from other men, and start training your sons to not fucking rape. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate all the questions that have come in, and I think they've taken us to all the really vital places that your book takes us to, Carol. So thank you for the book. And is there anything you'd like to say now in the kind of like the waning few seconds we have left that I haven't brought up, and I've loved our conversation, but is there anything you'd like to leave us with?
I think that if we could sort of say in unison, fuck the patriarchy, I think maybe that might shift the alignment of the planets or something.
Okay, everyone get ready. I usually do this in after 3. Yeah. Ready?
Okay. Yeah.
1, 2,
3.
Fuck
the patriarchy! Yes.
Perfect.
Thank you so much. This has been an honor. It's been wonderful to talk to you, Mona.
Thank you, Carol. I could have talked to you for another hour, and I look forward to the 7 future books.
Wonderful.
Thank you both so much for a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you having your event with us at the Strand. For those of you watching, if you haven't purchased Think Like a Feminist, there's a green button at the bottom of your screen you can click on. It'll take you directly to purchase it. If you'd like to purchase either of Mona's titles, I've dropped links in the chat along with a link to her website, Feminist Giant, where you can subscribe to her Substack, Feminist Giant.
Thank you so much, Sabir, for hosting. It was wonderful.
Oh, thank you, Sabir. It's always a pleasure to talk with and at the Strand.
Oh, no, thank you both so much. The conversation was enlightening and really enjoyable. And if you could see the comments on Facebook too, it had a wide reach.
Wonderful.
On that note, have a good night, everyone, and thank you for joining us.
Goodbye, all.